Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back in a badger outfit to present the Game Week 12 cheat sheet to you guys. As we know, we do have an Arsenal and City blank, and one of the key themes with Arsenal and City is that if you have 3 to 4 of those players within your team, you probably want to keep them. But if you have 5 to 6 Arsenal City players, it is probably worth transferring some of them out so you can actually field a reasonably good team this game week. I would say if you have the ability to play 9 to 10 good solid players this week who actually have good fixtures, or at least an opportunity to do well, then you're in the best position possible. And I would definitely advise not going for a free hit this week. The cheat sheet is specifically condensed to actually look at Game Week 12 because I think a lot of people are in different scenarios and I don't think I can adequately cover them. But the cheat sheet is laid out in a way where I am thinking about the futures ahead, but also the immediate impact of what you'd like to go for if you're targeting a very, very strong team for this week, especially since a lot of people do have issues such as James, such as Madison, and so on and so forth. If we look at the budget defenders, I think, or budget midfielders, sorry, you have only one change really with Willock dropping. I think the reason why Willock drops is because I think Almiron is still a preferred option, and I would just like the cheat sheet to actually reflect that. There's nothing particularly great here. Obviously, Newcastle have a fantastic fixture. It's probably one where I'd actually like to target Callum Wilson if I was going to go for a Newcastle attacker. But Almiron is still a very, very fine option as well. And Eze remains the top option because we did see a little bit of rest and rotation with Olise, and I think that's going to be something that will be present this season because we know Vieira has a propensity to rotate players quite a bit, and potentially that's something that we'll see with Edouard, where he might lose starting spots as well in the future as well. Because with Patrick Vieira, I would say we've always seen that whenever his players or even his strikers aren't delivering consistent performances, he's very happy to actually move on from them or at least provide some sort of rotation for the competitiveness of the team. As far as billing, he actually joins the cheat sheet as well. He's an interesting asset that has done incredibly well as of late at 5.3 for Bournemouth. Of course, I would say that his underlying stats aren't particularly good, but ultimately he's still getting a lot of consistent hauls, and you can still see him finding his way towards the box and actually trying to get involved in attacking scenarios. So I can't dismiss him outright as a poor option. I still think he is someone that you should probably avoid, and I think Solanke is much, much better than him. But for the time being, I'd probably actually still stick with other Bournemouth players such as Solanke and not really touch him for now. Trossard remains the top option. Rodrigo is still a second tier option. And the reason why is because I think Rodrigo actually still has a great fixture. We did see Bamford really let himself down with the penalty versus Arsenal. He doesn't look like a necessarily poor option, but I think Bamford obviously still has a ways to go to actually find some form. Remember, of course, that he's been an injury-ravaged player for the last 2 years, whereas Rodrigo is still someone who I think we would expect to do very well. And if Bamford is someone who's subject to get some rotation, then I think Rodrigo is someone who could benefit. Of course, Sinisterra is another option as well for Leeds if you're looking for a differential, but probably not one I would dip into for now. And Rashford, because he's not necessarily, I would say, nailed on to the starting 11, I just think he's a little bit more of an avoid for now than Anthony, but I still think his ceiling's very high just because his price is so low. And we do know this Rashford has shown at times this season how explosive he can be. With the rest of the team, I would say when you're looking at Zaha and you're looking at Anthony, these are the top options at this kind of weird price point of 7.0 to 7.9. And a lot of people will be looking at potentially replacing Zaha in the future because he has been a little bit of a troll as of late. But for this specific fixture, I really wouldn't touch Zaha at all. In fact, many people are still looking to bring in Zaha, even though he hasn't had the best performances as of late. I do think a lot of people are expecting Crystal Palace to find better form within the good run of fixtures that they have, and that's still reasonably the case for Zaha, unlike someone like Madison, who is going to have the suspension and then also the Man City game back-to-back. So therefore, Anthony also makes sense as an option. He, for me, is someone who's a little bit more nailed than Rashford and does justify his price increase compared to a Rashford, just because he has those minutes nailed. And I think we've already seen enough from Anthony so far in his Premier League short stint so far to actually consider him as an option. So that's kind of the state of things with the more budget side midfielders. As far as the really premium players, I'd say obviously Mount has found himself towards the cheat sheet at the very, very top. He's deserved it because he is someone who does seem to be a 85 to 90 minute man for Potter. Even in times of rotation, we're actually seeing Mount play. We saw him score a fantastic opportunity provided by Mings, unfortunately, in the Aston Villa game, and then later on a wonderful free kick. I would actually say just Mount is someone who does benefit from playing in a free-flowing attacking structure. He is someone who is a little bit of a gel-like player where he can combine very well with players, and he's almost like a little bit more of an advanced Odegaard in that sense. Of course, not necessarily the same sort of passing vision, but someone who you absolutely need to make sure that your possession style of football is actually going as you'd like it, and I think he is a little bit of a glue piece for this kind of Chelsea attack. So I do see Mount as someone who is quite interesting in this Potter team because even though I think we expect a lot of Potter rotation, Mount's probably least prone to it. at this point in time. As far as the truer premiums, we have Salah rising towards the top again, and Son, unfortunately, still staying as a second-tier option. Of course, Son just simply doesn't have as good a game as Salah, and not really as good a 3-game fixture run as Salah himself. Salah has Nottingham Forest right after this fixture, and he just looked good in that City match. He still made a lot of key mistakes, and someone as someone who's actually looking to go to Salah himself, I would say he hasn't looked as good as he did in the previous season, where he was making all the right decisions in the box, even being creative. We have, of course, heard discussions and, of course, visually seen Salah play quite deep in the right-hand side at the early parts of the season. But I do think Klopp has actually reverted back to allowing Salah to play much more central, and that does benefit him as well. And I think he is, of course, someone who can provide a lot more in our FPL teams when he's not just kind of looking for a diagonal cross from the right wing. And now that he's actually in these positions, of course, we'd hope he makes better decisions. I actually thought he had 2 opportunities to lay Jota off towards scoring a tap-in, but ultimately still Salah looks fantastic. It was still versus a very tough Man City defense, and I think when you're looking and heading into these fixtures and the possibility of penalties will also prop up, I just think Salah becomes a top option alongside someone like Sterling. Sterling is someone who's continuously blanked, I think 3 weeks in a row now, but for the eye test has looked fantastic. He actually hit the crossbar versus Aston Villa. If you have a chance to rewatch the highlights, and it just still looks very involved. His underlying numbers have not shied away from being the absolute best within this Chelsea team. So I still think Sterling's a top option, but whether owners are frustrated with him and actually looking to move out is a different kind of situation. I can understand why people want to do that. For me, it's a little bit of a different situation compared to someone like Saka, who, for example, blanked in the North London derby and didn't look particularly interesting, but then suddenly blew apart the next 2 fixtures within Liverpool and Leeds. I think Sterling has looked consistently good in almost every fixture so far, and there's really no reason to actually move away from him, so I think he's a top option still. Moving on to the forwards, I would say there hasn't really been many changes here. Scamacca has actually been added as an option. It's nice to see consistent starts for him in this West Ham side, but of course we did see him blank in the previous match for Southampton, and now he of course has a very tough fixture versus Liverpool, so he's not really one to consider, I would say, for this week specifically. Welbeck is an option to think about, especially if you're looking to transfer out of a player, but I think still the absolute best downgrade when it comes to, let's say, moving out of Kane, if you're looking to opt towards someone like a Salah this week, is to go for Solanke. I think he still is the absolute top budget option. When you look across the pond towards Edouard and Daka, they still have limited minutes. They're sharing that with other players, and Solanke really doesn't have that problem. At worst, he's going to be subbed off at 89 minutes. When you have Daka and when you have Scamacca, these are players who very easily can be rotated with the other kind of top premium option in the team, who I think their managers have historically shown an affinity towards. So that's kind of the issue there. And of course, this West Ham side still hasn't really found a creative flow. And we can see that with the underlying stats too. West Ham have severely underperformed this season in comparison to the last. And I think even though their fixtures are actually still quite good, you still have that impending Bournemouth fixture coming. I still think Bowen's the only option to really consider from West Ham. For top forward options in the 7.0 to 7.9 range, I do think Toney and Wilson are at the top, but Watkins also has a prime fixture this week. If you're looking, for example, for a free hit, he could really be a sneaky punt, because this Fulham team, we've been talking about them consistently. Anytime you can get a striker playing against Fulham, I think it's a great opportunity to really back. And Fulham have been such a poor defense that I would say Watkins is still probably okay to go for this fixture here to actually target. Otherwise, I don't really see Watkins as someone you'd like to move into. Toney, Wilson, Mitrovic, players like that are so much more consistent, and even Solanke at a downgrade. Firmino is someone who also rises in the cheat sheet, but I think he has a bit more long-term permanence than someone like Watkins, because we do have this really great 3 to 4 fixture run for Liverpool, and Firmino's probably going to play a lot of it because Jota's gotten injured. We don't exactly know the state of the Jota injury or how impactful it will be, but we've already seen a lot of great minutes from Firmino this season. And his goal-scoring efforts have improved tremendously this year. Not that that really impacts his minutes from, I think, Klopp's point of view. Klopp clearly sees Firmino as someone who's essential, not specifically for goal-scoring, but how he actually contributes to Liverpool's build-up. In this situation, though, I think Firmino's sort of had the best of both worlds this season, where he's been one of the key players for this Liverpool team. He's been very consistent, unlike someone like Darwin, who looks either very explosive or very timid or, very error-prone. I think Firmino has quite consistently overshot his expectations this season. His underlying numbers aren't fantastic, but I've enjoyed a lot from what I've seen from Firmino. As far as the other top options, there's not really much to talk about here. I don't think much has changed. Aubameyang, unfortunately, still has slightly limited minutes for me to actually still consider him as a top option, compared to someone like Sterling, who is still at a bit of a premium price. As far as Darwin, I think he does level up with Firmino, specifically because he does benefit, I would say, with the kind of new formational change that Liverpool have embarked on. And I think he still looked very good, even coming on as a sub versus Man City. As far as Ronaldo, still in the void for me. Of course, he's a third-tier option. Potentially, he's a fourth-tier option. As I said, a little bit of an avoid when you look at the context of the forward cheat sheet. But yeah, not enough from Ronaldo. I don't think he's really found his form. I also think he clearly has just lost a step this season. And there's not really much to discuss. I mean, we've seen a lot of dismaying performances in the Europa League. Meanwhile, someone like Kane has been absolutely consistent this season, much more consistent potentially than last year as well, when you look at his slightly poor start. So I think Kane is someone that I would still think about holding, especially if a lot of people are thinking about going for a hit away from Kane to Salah. That really sort of hurts my head because I think Kane has been so consistent and he still has a relatively good run. He's got Bournemouth soon. He's also done incredibly well in some of these tougher fixtures, scoring, for example, versus Arsenal. Yes, of course, through a penalty, but the consistency is something to actually admire. And I think ambitiously going for Salah might not exactly work out as many managers have planned. And we just have to really, I would say, be impressed by how good Kane has been this season. Potentially because of how good Erling has been. We have kind of lost our way a little bit with valuing Kane as an asset. I think he's a little bit under-owned and underpriced as well because of the price drops that he got. And now that he's done so well and he's been so consistent, a lot of people are still actually thinking of overweight for him. And that's such an interesting situation in FPL. Within the defensive positions, the only real changes is to kind of address who has the best fixtures from a clean sheet perspective in Game Week 12. It's very clear that Brighton and Newcastle have fantastic opportunities to do so. Also does Chelsea, but I think with Chelsea, the issue is they are a little bit more expensive as defensive options. You also now have the option to go towards someone like Kepa, who's much cheaper for this Chelsea team than someone like Thiago Silva or Koulibaly, who are obviously a little bit more expensive. And not only that, but Cucurella and Chilwell, I do think there will be some potential minutes rotation concerns that we've seen in the past. For example, we did see Chilwell miss the Wolves game. We also saw Cucurella subbed off at 45 minutes for Aston Villa. And these are the kind of things that you have to play around with. And it's a very similar gamble to, let's say, Doherty, who's also been included to the cheat sheet. When you look at someone like Doherty and you compare that to Romero, it's interesting because Romero is a little bit cheaper than someone like Eric Dyer. So if you want a kind of nailed-on Tottenham defender, he probably is available to you at a much cheaper price than Dyer, a little bit of a 0.4 transfer value saving there. Whereas Doherty, of course, is even cheaper, but the issue with Doherty is simply whether he actually gets consistent starts, because I do think that this season Conte has shown that he has grown in his admiration and also his, I think, affinity towards actually playing Emerson as a starter. And of course, Doherty did find a lot of time at the sidelines at the start of the season up until this Emerson red card. So that's one thing to think about when you're looking into investing into a Spurs defender. I think this 50-50 really just depends on what type of manager you are, and you might want to make that kind of investment based on whether you like the high risk of Doherty or rather the stability of someone like a Romero. Schär, of course, is a great Newcastle option. I think especially in the climate where the keepers are almost inflated because of how cheap Kepa is. Pope does seem like a little bit of an expensive keeper, and I would say Schär, of course, is a little bit more of a cut rate saving compared to someone like Pope, especially now that Ward and Iverson are also firing when it comes to getting clean sheets and actually being able to actually play as a competent defense. Wolves, they've also risen, and Leicester have also dropped. I think the simple reason is because I do think that this Wolves defense actually has a much more solid and stable makeup than the Leicester defense. And even though Leicester have arguably the better fixture here, I think Wolves definitely versus Crystal Palace away compared to Leicester, who are playing Leeds at home, is of course much more favored towards James Justin, where you'd like to plug in that kind of gap this week. But for the purposes of the future, I would say there's no real reason to own James Justin. It actually makes a lot more sense to own someone like Ward. I don't think James Justin is really going to get too many attacking contributions. We did see him draw a penalty versus Tottenham, but I don't think that's something that you can expect on or to rely on consistently. The underlying numbers are also not there to support that he's actually much more worth it to keep as an asset. So I think Ward on the bench in the future, for example, for one of our wild cards, is going to be the play to go for. Mings and Dean potentially are still dealing with injury concerns, and I think obviously the Aston Villa fixture turn has clearly gone worse. So I don't think there's really any value in going for Aston Villa defenders. Potentially you could even consider them as avoids for now, because despite the Fulham matchup being quite good on paper, I would say Fulham have actually been a very free-flowing offense. And when you look at, for example, the Bournemouth match, where Bournemouth are obviously a very defensive team in the league, and that actually mirrors very well with Aston Villa, the key thing here is that Fulham have been a very attacking side and very efficient and actually being able to score. So Aston Villa don't really have a great fixture on paper, even though Fulham might not be one of the strongest teams in the league. Within the top defenders, the only change here is Chilwell rising and also Van Dijk getting a reintroduction to the cheat sheet. Van Dijk is someone who had a fantastic performance for Man City, very much like the Van Dijk of old. No kind of keeping the hands at the back, very dominant in the air, very controlled as well, some diagonal passes, and just an overall great performance from Van Dijk. And with Chilwell, him getting consistent minutes at left back is very interesting. He might potentially be the preferred left back option in a back four compared to Cucurella, and I think that's really what's going to tell the tale of the tape with Cucurella versus Chilwell this season. I do think Chilwell has probably, I think in Potter's mind, potentially won that left back battle. I think he sees Cucurella as a little bit more of a depth option at left back. And then at the left centre back position, someone he can comfortably play. But I do think, as I said, Chilwell has that upside there because he is a much more comfortable attacker, especially someone who can also finish in the final third, as well as create some assisting opportunities, as we did see earlier in the season when Tuchel's kind of job was on the line. Last but not least, we do have the goalkeepers this week. I would say the only change here that's been very significant is the rise of Kepa, and I was quite timid to actually move Kepa towards the top option, even though he's been consistently starting now because of Edouard Mendy's injury and also his recovery process, but also Edouard Mendy sitting on the bench and also Kepa having such a fantastic performance in this Aston Villa game, and him potentially being a better player that suits Potter's style, where he is going to be passing out of the back at times. I do think Kepa is someone who we really want to value, specifically for the World Cup wildcard. I don't think necessarily we need to force transfers this week for someone like Kepa. If you are someone who owns someone like an Ederson, then potentially it could be an interesting transfer, right? To go into Ederson or go out of Ederson or Ramsdale and then into Kepa. I do think that that's very tempting. It also frees up the opportunity to go for another attacking slot within teams like Arsenal and City in the future. So if you are in that kind of position, I think that's a very interesting transfer to make. And that's pretty much it for the goalkeepers. I have re-risen Alisson because I thought Liverpool really showed, once again, a fantastic performance, much more like the Liverpool of old last season. But no real changes in the cheat sheet so far, and I would say Pope and Saw still probably options to actually skip because of how valuable Kepa is, and he kind of deflates, as I said, some of the actual value of the other keepers in the league.